Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive straight into the primary sources to uncover the stark contrast between the legendary explorer we all learned about in school and the chilling historical truth. Every single year, millions of people around the world celebrate Christopher Columbus, but today, we're going to pull back the curtain and look at the real history, the history that was hidden, ignored, or entirely rewritten for centuries.
So you know the story we usually hear, right? The heroic legend of a brave visionary who discovered a new world and was greeted by friendly native people on pristine beaches. Well, today, we are going to look squarely at the dark truth. Backed up by eyewitness accounts, historical documents, and Columbus's very own journals, we'll see a man who is actually driven by extreme religious zeal, a total obsession with gold, and a frightening willingness to unleash mass slaughter.
Section 1. The Man Behind the Myth.
Okay, let's completely shatter that one schoolbook myth right out of the gate. You were probably taught that Columbus was bravely fighting flat earth theorists, but that is simply not true. Educated people, scientists, and sailors in 1492 already knew the Earth was a sphere. They'd known that since ancient Greek times. The actual debate he was having was purely about the size of the Earth, not its shape.
The real issue was a massive, almost fatal mathematical error. Columbus relied on calculations from a medieval Islamic astronomer, but he completely confused Arabic miles with shorter Italian miles. He boldly argued it was only about 3,700 kilometers to Japan. The experts of his day warned him the actual distance was over 19,000 kilometers, and you know what? They were 100% correct. The only reason Columbus and his crew survived starvation is because the Americas just happened to be blocking his path.
So, if it wasn't pure scientific curiosity, what was actually driving him? Well, historical documents reveal Columbus was heavily motivated by personal greed for wealth and status. He demanded a 10% cut of all treasures and the fancy title Admiral of the Ocean Sea from the Spanish monarchs. On top of that, he had this apocalyptic religious worldview, seeing himself as a holy messenger destined to fund a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem. He literally even started signing his name Christ-bearer.
Section 2. First Contact and Betrayal.
Now this is where it gets really dark. Listen to his exact words written in his private journal during his very first days in the Americas. He wrote, "They should be good servants. With 50 men, they could all be subjected and made to do all that one might wish." The Taíno people welcomed him, offered food, and helped his men. But Columbus instantly saw these incredibly generous people as easy targets for subjugation. He didn't see fellow human beings, he just saw a trusting population ready to be enslaved.
And things escalated incredibly quickly. After Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria, wrecked on a reef, the local Taíno chief actually cried for him and helped salvage the ship. Columbus had to leave 39 men behind at a crude fort called La Navidad, but despite this initial hospitality, the Spanish men left behind succumbed to their own greed. They went completely rogue, roaming the island and terrorizing the native population. This, understandably, triggered violent retaliation from a neighboring chief named Cayanabo, who burned the fort to the ground. When Columbus returned with a massive second fleet of 1,200 men, he used that very retaliation as his perfect excuse to launch a full-scale conquest.
Section 3. The Reign of Terror.
Now governor of Hispaniola, Columbus realized the massive, easily accessible gold mines he promised Spain simply didn't exist. To extract wealth anyway, he implemented the encomienda system. To put it simply, this was essentially a brutal regime of localized slavery in all but name. Families were torn apart, men were sent into the mines, and women were sent to the fields, all worked to the point of absolute physical exhaustion.
But the true horror really lay in his terrifying gold quota system. He ordered all Taíno people aged 14 and older to find a specific quota of gold dust every 3 months. If they succeeded, they received a little copper token to wear around their necks. But if they failed to meet that quota, the punishment was horrific physical mutilation. Spanish soldiers would literally hack off their hands and leave them bleeding to death in the jungle. The Spanish priest Bartolomé de las Casas traveled to the region and witnessed these atrocities firsthand. He documented a terror so absolute that the entire Taíno society just collapsed under the weight of it. To escape this inescapable torture, thousands of Taíno chose mass suicide, or they fled deep into the mountains only to be hunted down for sport by attack dogs.
Because those gold quotas were practically impossible to meet, Columbus pivoted to pioneering the transatlantic slave trade. If he couldn't send gold back, well, he was going to send human beings. In 1495, he organized a massive slave raid, locking 1,500 Taíno in pens. He shipped 500 of them to Seville, Spain in nightmarish, freezing conditions. Tragically, over 200 of those people died on that dark, cramped voyage and were simply thrown overboard.
Section 4. A tyrant in chains.
For centuries, people argued that reports of his brutality were just exaggerated. But a major historical discovery in 2005 changed everything. The Bobadilla Report, which was a lost 48-page manuscript found deep in the Spanish state archives, contains undeniable, sworn testimonies of his absolute abuse of power.
And what's wild is that his cruelty wasn't just reserved for indigenous people. This report details how Columbus and his brothers ran a ruthless military dictatorship over their own Spanish colonists. They mutilated starving Spaniards for minor thefts like taking corn. In one completely shocking incident, a woman was paraded naked and her tongue was cut out simply for suggesting Columbus was of lowly birth. He even left the bodies of Spanish colonists hanging from gallows at the mouth of the river as a very public, very gruesome warning.
The Knight Commander Francisco de Bobadilla arrived, and he was so shocked by the lawlessness and widespread terror that he took immediate action. He stripped Columbus of his titles, confiscated his property, locked the so-called Admiral of the Ocean Sea in heavy iron chains, and shipped him right back to Spain as a disgraced prisoner.
Section 5. The Math of Devastation.
Now, let's talk about the sheer scale of the demographic collapse here, because the numbers are absolutely staggering. When Columbus arrived in 1492, there were an estimated 500,000 or more Taíno living on Hispaniola. Just 4 years later, by 1496, that number was cut in half. And by 1548, barely 50 years later, there were less than 500 left. Think about that for a second. Over a single human lifetime, a vibrant population of 500,000 people was systematically eradicated.
This rapid extermination was driven by 3 primary killers. First, Old World diseases like smallpox and measles, to which the indigenous people had zero immunity. Second, the brutal forced labor system that caused widespread starvation and physical exhaustion. And finally, outright military slaughter, which was coupled with such profound despair that it led to those mass suicides we mentioned earlier.
Section 6. The creation of the myth.
So if the historical record of his tyranny and total failure is this crystal clear, we have to ask, how on earth did Columbus become a celebrated hero? Well, the sanitized myth was actually manufactured centuries later. Following the Revolutionary War, the early United States desperately needed a non-British founding symbol. Then, in 1828, author Washington Irving basically published a wildly popular, fictionalized romantic biography of Columbus, painting him as a misunderstood genius. Finally, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, marginalized Italian-American immigrants championed Columbus to combat severe xenophobia and prove they belonged in America. All of this culminated in Columbus Day becoming a federal holiday, while the incredibly dark chapters of his history were completely swept under the rug.
Today, as many cities and states shift towards celebrating Indigenous Peoples' Day, historians are shifting the focus from the man who arrived to the millions of people who were already here. And look, it isn't about erasing history. Rather, it's about having the courage to tell the complete, unvarnished truth of what really happened according to the primary sources. It's acknowledging the bridge between worlds, sure, but also fully acknowledging the shattered lives that built it.
I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to end our explainer today. Knowing the dark reality documented by his own contemporaries, and literally by his own pen, how do you think we should remember Christopher Columbus today?
Please like and subscribe.